I never understood why people said love arrives when you least expect it. I always assumed love required intention, timing, preparation, a deliberate decision made with a clear mind. But the truth showed up differently for me, and it did so on a day that felt completely ordinary, wrapped in the mundane rhythm of my routine. I was riding the early train to work, the kind of morning ride where every passenger looked half awake and half lost in thoughts. The city was still stretching into the day, and the sky outside the windows carried that muted blue that appears before the sun fully commits to rising. I had my headphones on, listening to something I no longer remember, when she entered the train at the next stop. She didn't make an entrance that demanded attention. She simply walked in, carrying a book and a quiet confidence that somehow filled the space around her. Her presence wasn't loud, yet it drew my eyes before I even had time to question why. She scanned the car briefly, noticed an empty seat across from me, and sat down with the ease of someone who wasn't in a hurry but also didn't intend to waste a moment of her day. At first, it was the book that caught my eye. I recognized the cover instantly. It was one of my favorites, a story I read during a difficult period of my life. Seeing her read it opened some long-dormant corner of my memory, and I found myself watching her, trying to guess which part she was on, whether she already sensed the emotional shift the story was about to take. There was something comforting in the way her fingers held the pages gently, almost reverently. I tried not to stare, but I kept stealing glances as the train moved. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, stopped reading occasionally to look out the window, as if the passing city reminded her of something important. It was in those small pauses that I noticed the softness of her expression, the subtle tiredness beneath her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. She seemed like someone who carried entire worlds inside her. When the train jolted unexpectedly and her bookmark fell to the floor, I instinctively reached down to pick it up at the same time she did. Our fingers brushed lightly, and she let out a small laugh, warm, unexpectedly familiar, like sunlight slipping through curtains. She thanked me, and her voice carried a melody I couldn't quite define. That moment lasted only seconds, but it anchored itself inside me with surprising intensity. The next morning, she appeared again. Same time. Same train. Same book, though a few chapters deeper. This time she smiled the moment she saw me, as if acknowledging some unspoken connection formed by coincidence and shared mornings. I returned the smile, feeling a spark of something I couldn't name yet. By the third day, it no longer felt like coincidence. She sat across from me again, and after a few minutes, she closed her book, looked directly at me, and said, "You know, it's starting to feel like we're characters in the same story." I laughed, partly because it was true, partly because her courage caught me off guard. I told her that if we were in a story, she was definitely the interesting character, the one readers rooted for. She raised an eyebrow, amused, and said, "And what about you? What character are you?" I told her I wasn't sure yet. And that was the beginning. Our morning train rides slowly became the highlight of my days. We talked about books, music, the strange beauty of cities waking up. We shared small pieces of our lives, nothing too personal at first, just fragments that hinted at who we were. I learned she was an artist, though she said it with the shyness of someone not used to being recognized. She learned I had a habit of fixating on small details, a trait she claimed made me observant, though I always thought it made me overly cautious. Over time, the distance between us, physical and emotional, began to shrink. Some mornings, she would rest her head lightly against the cool glass of the window, and I watched the reflections dance across her features. Other mornings, she'd talk passionately about a new project she was working on, her hands moving as if they needed the air to help express what words couldn't fully capture. I found myself memorizing the rhythm of her voice, the cadence of her laughter, the subtle ways she expressed excitement or disappointment. But it wasn't until one particularly cold morning that everything shifted. The train was delayed, and passengers grumbled impatiently on the platform. She arrived shivering slightly, her fingers tucked into her sleeves for warmth. Without thinking, I offered her my scarf. She looked at me with surprise, soft, grateful, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. She wrapped it around her neck, inhaling the lingering scent of coffee and winter air, and said quietly, "Thank you. You always notice things." That sentence stayed with me long after she said it. It felt like the beginning of something deeper, something fragile and blooming. The train finally arrived, and we boarded. She sat closer than usual, our arms brushing every time the train swayed. At one point, she leaned her head toward me, almost resting on my shoulder, and whispered, "Can I tell you something strange?" I nodded. She hesitated, then continued, "These mornings with you, they feel like the only part of my day that makes sense." I didn't have words at that moment. Instead, I lightly placed my hand over hers, and she let her fingers settle into mine with a familiarity that felt both new and inevitable. From that day forward, our connection grew not in dramatic leaps but in quiet, steady steps. We spent evenings walking through the city, discovering hidden streets and unremarkable corners that somehow became special simply because she was there. She told me stories about her childhood, her fears, her ambitions. I shared the parts of myself I rarely spoke about, the doubts, the dreams, the uncertainties I carried. With her, vulnerability didn't feel like a risk, it felt like a natural part of showing up as my true self. Love didn't arrive in a single moment. It built itself slowly, through shared mornings and whispered conversations, through comfortable silences and laughter that lingered long after it ended. It grew in the spaces between us, the small gestures, the warm glances, the trust that deepened with every passing day. The moment I realized I was in love with her happened on a quiet Sunday morning. We had met for breakfast, and she was sitting across from me in a small bakery, sunlight forming a soft halo around her. She looked up from the pastry she was tearing apart and smiled at me, gently, almost shyly. Something about that smile, unpretentious, full of warmth, hit me with a clarity I had never felt before. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. She had become the meaning behind my mornings, the softness in my evenings, the calm in my uncertainties. She had become, without trying, the place my heart recognized as home. And now, every day with her feels like a story I'm lucky enough to continue writing. Not a story of perfection, but of presence. Not a story of grand gestures, but of quiet truths. Not a story of finding someone to complete me, but someone who sees me, understands me, and chooses to walk beside me. A love that didn't arrive loudly, but gently. A love that didn't ask for permission, it simply became part of my life. And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it.